Coming up on this episode, the Warriors concluded their Summer League campaign with a loss to the Toronto Raptors on Saturday. I'll have all the major takeaways from what was a winless Vegas stint, plus why owner Joe Lacob isn't kidding anyone with his latest comments that are trying to rewrite history, and Stephen Curry adds to his sporting legacy, this time on the golf course. Yes, welcome back to another episode of the Golden State with Mates podcast. The Warriors finished up their Summer League campaign on Saturday with another loss. That was 5 straight in Vegas, a winless campaign. They finished 1-6 overall, dating back to the start of the California Classic. They led by 14 in the third quarter against the Raptors, who went into the game winless as well. So two sides that were really struggling. The Warriors, it looked positive for them in the opening 3 periods, only for the Raptors to go on a massive run in the fourth quarter and overturn a 9-point deficit at the end of 3 quarters to end up pulling away with a 108-101 victory. Some of the takeaways here from Vegas, I had an article earlier today or yesterday, you'll probably be listening to this, on Blue Man Hoop covering the major takeaways. So I won't say too much. There's a couple of players I'd like to obviously dive deeper into here. We'll start just quickly with a couple of players. First up, Guy Santos didn't play in that loss to the Raptors on Saturday, but a very impressive Summer League performance from him nonetheless. I've spoken about him at length on previous episodes, so I don't need to go too much into it here, but 17.3 points per game in Vegas really showed an improved offensive game, both off the ball and on the ball. It's funny because he shot 50% from the floor, which is obviously incredibly efficient, fantastic, but only 25% from 3, which is funny because each time he took a 3-pointer, which was 6 attempts per game, I actually felt more confident in it. It felt more sustainable than what we'd seen previously in Summer League last year and even in the G League with Santa Cruz. So that's going to be the big thing with him. If he does get to the next level, I've spoken about the fact I think he should be on a 2-way contract with the Warriors next season, but obviously with the main squad, if he does get there, he's going to have more of an off-ball role. So yes, while he wants to develop the on-ball parts of his game, the ability to get in the post and use his 6'7" size to overpower players, whether it's being able to take the ball from the perimeter inside, while it's good to work on all those aspects of his game, I do think that it's most important to continue that 3-point shot to get it to a level where once he does get into the league, teams aren't going to leave him wide open, where teams are going to respect that jump shot, and therefore that can open up other aspects of his game, whether it's putting the ball on the floor and getting to the basket or something like that. That's going to be the big thing for him transitioning to the next level, because 25% certainly isn't going to cut it and isn't going to allow for any opponent to respect that jump shot from deep. So there's positive signs, there's no doubt about that. I think his combination of size and offensive versatility, there's certainly something there. I think he's an NBA level talent, just about working on his game. And I do think there's been an accelerated growth here that's quite exciting, that means that maybe he's not so much of a project type that could come in 2-3 years down the track. Maybe he's someone you can put on a 2-way deal now, and as I've said previously, maybe in another 12 months' time, he's almost ready for a standard contract and he could be a part of an NBA rotation under Steve Kerr. But we'll wait and see with Guy Santos. As I've said, whether or not he's on a 2-way contract or not, it would be fantastic to see him back with the Santa Cruz Warriors rather than returning to Brazil or elsewhere overseas. I think he's got a contract with the Brazilian team for next season, so we'll see how that plays out, but certainly promising signs from him during Summer League. The other one who was clearly Golden State's best player across Summer League was Lester Quinones. Finished off in spectacular fashion, really, against the Raptors on Saturday. Really stuffed the box score. 32 points, 4 rebounds, 6 assists, 3 steals, and 2 blocks in that performance, and really kept the Warriors in it when offensively down the stretch, they really weren't getting too much else going. So his final averages for the Vegas stint were 21.2 points, 4.6 rebounds, and 5.2 assists. The biggest thing for me, not only was he the Warriors' best player, which doesn't really say a whole lot given they had a winless record, but more importantly, he just looked above the Summer League level. And that's what you wanted to see from a guy who's coming off a G League season where he really put up some fantastic numbers towards the end of the season, was ultimately named the league's most improved player. There's something here with this guy that the Warriors really need to tap into. Again, as I've stated on previous episodes, I think they'd be fortunate to retain him on a 2-way contract. I think if I was him, I'd be searching around trying to find a standard deal. Hopefully, for his sake and for the Warriors' sake, that puts, well, not necessarily for the Warriors' sake, but for his sake, maybe that puts pressure on the Warriors to come up with a standard contract. We don't know what they're doing yet with their 14th roster spot, but perhaps there's a case where he gets a deal from another team and says, well, I'm taking this if you don't put me on the full roster, on the main roster. He is a dynamic offensive player, and I really like the fact that as Summer League progressed, he's not just a jump shooter, he's not just a three-point threat. He can get to the rim. He averaged, I think, nearly 7 free throw attempts per game during Summer League, so the ability to get to the rim and draw fouls is a big part of his game and only adds to the comparisons between him and Jordan Poole, because we've got to remember, losing Jordan Poole takes a lot of the explosiveness that the Warriors had in their offense out from next season and beyond. Jordan Poole's ability to get to the rim, yes, it was haphazard at times. Yes, it led to turnovers. Yes, there were some wild shots at the rim, possibly. But his ability to actually draw fouls was a big part of the Golden State offense, really, because there's no one else. Andrew Wiggins can potentially provide some rim pressure. Same with Jonathan Kuminga, albeit that's in a more limited role. Poole was actually a pretty big facet of the Warriors actually trying to get inside rather than just living on the perimeter, which is where they struggled at times for a large portion of last season, was when they became way too three-point heavy. We know with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson and Poole himself last season, they are always going to be three-point focused, but I think Poole's ability to get to the rim was a nice dynamic there, his ability to finish and draw fouls. They've lost that, and so Quinones, the comparisons with Poole aren't just from a skill set perspective, but of what he can add to the Warrior offense. I think it could be crucial, and I can see him, again, whether it's on a 2-way contract or whether it's with the main roster, I can see him playing a role during next regular season, given he's a guard that's going to be behind a 38-year-old Chris Paul and a 35-year-old Steph Curry, even a veteran in Corey Joseph as well. Those guys are expected to miss portions of next regular season, that's for sure. Now, do I think he's going to be a playoff rotation piece by next season? Absolutely not. But I think that he's a nice dynamic offensive option that you can put out there when Steph or CP3 are missing a game here or there. And I do think that maybe he is good enough to push for a genuine rotation spot, 5-10 minutes, whatever it is, per game. Otherwise, because let's be honest, you're only going to want Chris Paul out there for 20-25 minutes per game, even when he is playing next season, to make sure that he's right, healthy, ready to go for next season's playoffs, assuming the Warriors do get to that point. But Lester Quinones, very impressive. Clearly the Warriors' best player throughout Summer League. Look, 37.3% from the floor and 26.7% from three-point range. It's not fantastic. However, I do think that came about because of the Warriors' alternative lack of offensive options and just the offensive load that he had to bear throughout Summer League. Like, they really needed him. His not only the volume of shots that he was taking, but the difficulty of some of the shots he was taking are simply not what you're going to get with the main squad next season if he does get an opportunity. So I wouldn't be too concerned with those shooting percentages, because we've seen that he is a an efficient shot maker at the G League level, and now we'll just see whether or not that translates to the next level should he get an opportunity, as I said. Brandon Podziemski, look, more struggles, I guess, over the last couple of games. 26.3% from the floor for the Vegas stint, 21.7% from three. 6 assists per game. The court vision and the playmaking, absolutely fantastic. Nothing's changed from what I said a couple episodes ago where I just mentioned him as, look, he's a primary point guard at this point, and we'll wait and see whether the 43.8% with Santa Clara last season can translate to the NBA level, or whether or not it's a case of, hey, we're coming up against better athletes here, more closeouts, tougher contests at the rim and in the mid-range, whatever else, and whether his lack of athleticism could be a hindrance at the next level. I don't think the lack of athleticism is an absolute disaster, and I do think the Warriors have a player there. I just think that it's going to take time, and it's going to take plenty of reps with Santa Cruz next season, and maybe in year 2 before he does become that rotation player that the Warriors wish him to be. The biggest one, though, and the one that I want to talk about the most, who we patiently waited for, didn't we, coming off the hamstring injury, but we got to see Trayce Jackson-Davis for 2 games to end Summer League. And although the Warriors lost those 2 games, I do think that Trayce Jackson-Davis was a major, major positive. Probably the biggest positive. I mean, we can look at Quinones, yes, but his contractual situation with the Warriors is still up in the air, so we can't really be too specific with him at the moment. Trayce Jackson-Davis is on the roster. He is going to be with the Warriors, unless he's surprisingly traded. He is going to be with the Warriors next season, and potentially into year 2 as well, depending on how much impact he can have in his rookie season, which could be more than what some people would have expected, especially out of a 57th overall pick. Obviously, 23 years of age, more advanced, and you can see, I think, that through his first 2 games in Summer League, there's clearly a maturity there that makes him different from other athletic but slightly smaller Warrior big men in the past. I mentioned last week the comparison that I had between him and Marquise Chris. I think there's a lot more maturity about Trayce Jackson-Davis. I think he's a much more fit for the Warrior system. He's got a better feel for the game than what Marquise Chris would have had. Another comparison is Jordan Bell, especially with the athleticism. I mean, this guy is a really good athlete. Now, yes, he's only 6'9", he's undersized, but in terms of the vertical floor spacing that he can provide the Warriors, the vertical floor spacing that he could potentially provide Chris Paul in the pick and roll game, I think it's a really exciting element that the Golden State don't really have at this point. I do think that watching him over the first 2 games, I wonder where his ceiling is at the NBA level, because he's 6'9", and he's got really no signs of a jump shot at this point. He showed no signs of a jump shot really in college either. So where does his ceiling lie when you're lacking major size and when you're lacking anything outside of the restricted area, basically, in terms of scoring? That's why he was ultimately taken at 57th overall, I think, and obviously with the fact he's 23, coming 4 years of college experience in Indiana. However, the stat lines read really well, and the play reads really well from his 2 games. 14 and 7 in his debut game, couldn't have done any more, and more impressive even against the Raptors on Saturday with 18 and 10. 8 of those rebounds came on the offensive end, which is one, really exciting, but it also made me question, it's like, you're getting 8 on the offensive end, could you not have done more potentially on the defensive end? But you do have others, like Quinones is a reasonable rebounder for a guard, and Podziemski as well, we've identified previously, is a great rebounder for a guard at this point, at least of what we've seen in Summer League and what we saw in college. So, very impressive, Trayce Jackson-Davis. The biggest thing for me, I think, going back to his lack of a jump shot is, yes, it may become an issue and you would like to see him develop that part of his game, but I'm actually pretty excited by his scoring threat just as a roller or playing in the dunker spot, and the ability to put up 14, 18 points in 2 Summer League games coming off a hamstring injury. And I spoke about that vertical floor spacing before that the Warriors haven't really had in recent times. Obviously, James Wiseman was supposed to be that guy, but defensively and just his fit in the Warriors system was never able to get to a consistent point where he was able to play for more than 5-10 minutes a night before the Warriors obviously traded him to the Detroit Pistons at the February trade deadline. we love Kevon Looney. Absolutely love Kevon Looney. He's turned himself into a fantastic player, one of the best role players in the NBA. But one of the biggest and most frustrating things with Loon is the fact that you often see him receive passes in the paint, whatever else, and there might be an alley-oop opportunity, and just that lack of athleticism with Loon means that he has to bring the ball back down. And how many times do you see him get stuck under the rim where he has to pump fake before finally getting his shot off? And that's something that I think it's nothing against Loon. That's just who he is. He's had a lot of injuries earlier in his career. But it is a frustrating element, especially when you're bringing in someone like Chris Paul who can throw lob passes. We know he's known for that from his time with the Clippers. And Trayce Jackson-Davis is going to be able to bring that element in terms of, yes, he's only 6'9", but his ability to get up there, he's got a nice wingspan, he can reach anything and slam it down. I think he's going to be an element that the Warriors could potentially utilise next season. I spoke on last episode as well about his ability just to power through guys, to actually use his 6'9" size to play at that size or above, to be able to power through guys, to be able to finish around the rim. So I do think that it's an exciting prospect to have a guy who's scored 14 and 18 points in 2 games, specifically just as a roller or in the dunker spot. And if he can bring anything new to his game in terms of scoring the ball, in terms of the post-up game or a little 15-foot jump shot, whatever it is, then that's a really exciting player to have on your hands. I did see a comparison on Twitter to Bam Adebayo. Now, I think we need to just calm down a little bit on that. Bam Adebayo is an all-star level player in this league. I don't think Trayce Jackson-Davis is ever going to get to that level at all. I think Bam has a mid-range jump shot for starters, which Jackson-Davis could develop, sure, but I'm not sure he's ever going to develop the kind of defensive versatility that Bam has as one of the best defenders in the league. I don't think anyone's expecting Trayce Jackson-Davis to ever be that player. So I think we need to hold off on those comparisons just a little bit. But again, go back to, could the Warriors utilise this guy in the rotation next season? Now, if we go back to last season, I don't think they would have been able to, because playing alongside Jordan Poole, I don't think there would have been the need for Jackson-Davis as much as there will be next season when you've got Chris Paul in place, who can utilise a rolling threat, who can utilise a lob threat. And that's what Jackson-Davis could deliver for the Warriors. And what they don't have aside from him really on the Warriors, apart from Kuminga, but then Kuminga's not a 5 at all. In fact, I mean, he could be. Honestly, he possibly could be in this Warrior system next year. You could maybe utilise Kuminga as a centre, specifically on the offensive side of the floor, where you could use him as a rolling threat, as a lob threat for Chris Paul. But Trayce Jackson-Davis, very exciting period to end Summer League from him, and looking forward to what he can potentially deliver for Golden State next season. We'll take a quick break here. Afterwards, we'll get into Joe Lacob's recent comments on the Warriors' supposed 2-timeline approach, and recap Steph Curry's huge performance over the weekend in Nevada. So there's a really good article over the last couple of days from Madeline Kenny of the Mercury News, interviewing Joe Lacob and getting some comments on some of the off-season activity from the Warriors. And this thing really stood out to me, this quote. I just want to read it to you. He says, "There's no such thing as the 2 timelines. There never was and still isn't and never will be. There's only one timeline, and the timeline is every year to put the best product on the floor, to have the best team, to compete the best you can to win a championship." That's Joe Lacob's quote in this article from Madeline Kenny. And look, Lacob's right to a degree, obviously, and he can say what he wants and he can think what he wants. He's entitled to that. He's a fantastic owner, and I don't want to rip Joe Lacob in any way, because I think every Warrior fan should be ecstatic that he's the owner. His capacity to spend money and how he's handled this team since he took over a decade ago has been nothing short of extraordinary and fantastic. However, I do think he's trying to rewrite history here by trying to resist the notion that there was never a 2-timeline approach. And if you look at the Warriors drafting, especially since Wiseman was taken, second overall pick in 2020, that would indicate completely differently to what he's trying to say here. And what he's trying to say here is actually trying to rewrite history simply because the two timeline approach from Golden State hasn't worked out. It simply hasn't. They got rid of Wiseman at the trade deadline, and now their most proven young piece, Jordan Poole, has been traded for a 38-year-old Chris Paul. They have given up on the two timeline approach to take a win now approach, which I think most Warrior fans are very happy with because they want to maximize and prioritize Stephen Curry, who's now 35 years old. So that's great. But you can't then tell us that, hey, we never actually had a two timeline approach in place. Well, you did. You absolutely did. Because if you didn't, then you probably would have dealt Wiseman before you did. You probably would have dealt him last offseason when you basically had the choice between him and Gary Payton II, and you let Gary Payton II walk when he got a 3-year, $27 million deal from the Trailblazers, when you had Wiseman on the roster for practically the same money. You could have traded Wiseman at that point and been able to keep Payton, and that would have been more of a win-now approach, obviously. The whole Poole thing comes down to the fact that they are prioritizing their aging core. They specifically prioritize Draymond Green over Jordan Poole. I think we all understand that it was becoming an untenable situation for Jordan Poole and Draymond Green to be playing on the same team from next season and beyond. And the Warriors chose Draymond Green. Even if initially they didn't. They gave Poole the extension, 4-year, $128. They traded Poole, knowing full well they were going to bring back Draymond Green a couple of weeks later. And they did, 4-year, $100 million extension for Draymond Green. So I think by trying to change the narrative here of saying, oh no, there wasn't a two timeline approach in place, I think that's not really giving respect to the knowledge of the fan base, because I think the fan base is knowledgeable enough to understand that this is nothing but trying to rewrite history and trying to change a narrative simply because the plan hasn't worked out. Now, have the Warriors been trying to win a championship since they drafted Wiseman in 2020? Absolutely, and they did. They did in 2022. Fantastic. However, every one of the young players outside Poole really didn't have an impact on that. It was the aging core. It was the likes of Otto Porter Jr. It was Gary Payton II, who they lost and then brought back. It was Andrew Wiggins. It was Loon. Everyone outside Poole of the Warrior younger players didn't have an impact. Wiseman didn't play a game that season. Kuminga and Moody were in their rookie year. Let's not try and rewrite history and say that there was never a two timeline approach in place. How much trade speculation did we see regarding Wiseman before he was dealt? How much trade speculation did we see regarding the 7th and 14th overall picks before they ultimately took Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody? So to suggest that there wasn't a two timeline approach in place, to suggest that there wasn't a desire to create a dynamic where you could have your cake and eat it too and try and have sustained success for a 15 to 20 year plus period, like, that's just false. It just is. I'm sorry, Joe. I love you. You've been fantastic. That's just a false narrative to try and rearrange, basically. But, I mean, I think most Warrior fans are pretty happy with the direction that the franchise is now taking, where there's a prioritizing Stephen Curry. And that's embodied by the fact they've got rid of Wiseman, they've got rid of Poole, and they've brought in a 38-year-old Chris Paul. Anyway, talking of Stephen Curry, what a weekend for the two-time MVP on the golf course. So he's won the American Century Championship, and what a way to do it. He had a hole-in-one on the second round on the 7th hole, 152 yards, sent social media into an absolute frenzy, and then backed it up on Sunday by having an eagle putt on 18. He went into the final hole trailing former tennis player Marty Fish, just quickly actually, on the tennis. What a men's Wimbledon final we had between Carlos Alcaraz, who eventually got the better of the player I think is the greatest of all time in Novak Djokovic. I'm a big tennis fan, happy to have those conversations with people on Twitter if need be. But thought I'd mention that. Back to Steph though. He holes out on 18, eagle putt, wins it to defeat Marty Fish. absolutely unbelievable. The first active athlete to win the tournament since the year 2000. And Andre Iguodala had a pretty bold declaration in the aftermath saying Steph Curry is the greatest athlete of our time. It was backed up shortly after by Lester Quinones, who retweeted it and had a comment. I can't remember what it was, but he had a comment regarding it, basically confirming what Iggy was saying. So it gets me thinking now. Is Stephen Curry the greatest athlete of our time? Well, what's our time? I mean, Iggy's nearly 40 years old, so are we saying 40 years? Let's say that, 40 years, right? I just think it's impossible to define who is the greatest athlete of all time. It's legitimately impossible to... You can make an argument for whoever, really, within boundaries, obviously. But I think it's impossible to define specifically who the greatest athlete of all time is. I mean, my initial thought is, well, Usain Bolt's the quickest man to ever exist. 9.58 seconds, like, is it him? He'd probably be my first argument, but that's just completely flawed. Like, there's no right answer here. There is no right answer. However, I do think you can specifically have more arguments on more defined aspects of athleticism. So obviously, you've got speed, endurance, vertical, like whatever it is. But one of the big aspects of obviously athleticism is hand-eye coordination. And I think Jason Timpf had this argument on Twitter after the hole-in-one, I think it was, before he even won the championship, saying that Steph might have the greatest hand-eye coordination we've ever seen. And that's an argument that I think is I'd be more willing to have, and that you could make an argument for, is that Steph Curry does have the greatest or the best hand-eye coordination of all time. Because I think you could make the argument that Steph is the most skilled basketball player of all time. I think Steph physically goes under the radar still, because the transition that he's made from when he first entered the league now, from a physicality standpoint, is night and day. It's unbelievable, and I think that goes under the radar, and the physical capacity to be able to run around screens all day and the kind of endurance level that he has is quite outstanding. However, he's 6'3" in a sport that prioritizes taller players, and for him to be as good as he is takes an incredible kind of skill that might be unmatched throughout NBA history. The fact that he is a arguably top 10 player of all time, I think consensus top 2 point guard of all time, along with a 6'9" Magic Johnson. So you take that, the most skilled NBA player of all time, potentially, and you add in the freakish golfing talents, I think you could quite easily argue he's got the best hand-eye coordination ever, that we've ever seen. So another outstanding performance, absolutely unbelievable. Makes me think whether or not there's a chance he tries to join the Pro Tour once he finishes up with the Warriors and finishes up with basketball. Potentially. I'm not sure what Aisha and his children would have to say about that, but he's a freak of nature. And hopefully, for Warrior fans' perspective, he won't be able to be in quite tip-top shape when it comes to golf next year, because he did have that comment after the hole-in-one that basically said his form at this point is down to the fact that the Warriors were eliminated early on in the playoffs by the Lakers. So hopefully we don't have a repeat of that next season. Other than that, guys, that will be it for this episode. Make sure to give us a follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you tune in. YouTube as well, you can subscribe over there. This clip will be published in full, along with shorter clips as well. Follow me, Peter O'Keefe, at POC252 on Twitter or Threads. Got a guest lined up for next episode, so looking forward to that.